My name is Claire. I'm 29 years old. And this is how my father erased me in one sentence. That night, the dining room was crowded with relatives. My father raised his glass and cleared his throat. You are not my blood. Don't ever call me your father again. The room went silent. Whispers spread like fire across the table. I sat frozen, my smile cracking, my hands shaking under the linen. Have you ever lived through something like this? Share it in the comments. And my mother, she didn't defend me. She kept her eyes on the plate, lips pressed shut. Her silence hurt more than his words. The days after that dinner felt like walking through glass. Relatives who once hugged me wouldn't meet my eyes. At church, a cousin glanced over and whispered to another, "That's the one he disowned," she said, pretending to pray. Home was worse than the looks. My bedroom door was locked without a word. My brother stood in the hallway, thumbs hooked in his pockets. "You don't live here anymore," he said, enjoying each syllable. I turned the knob until my palm burned. "Dad says the couch is good enough for you," he added. That couch broke my back for weeks. Every morning I folded the blanket like a careful tenant. At school, the rumor moved faster than I could breathe. 2 classmates watched me pass and tried to hide their laughter. "She's not even his real kid," one said too loudly. "Imagine being that unwanted," the other answered, eyes on me. I buried my face in assignments until the words swam. A teacher asked if I was sleeping. I lied and nodded. The money stopped next. The bursar called about tuition that was suddenly past due. I texted my father a screenshot of the balance. He replied with 3 words, "Figure it out." I stared at those words until my vision blurred. The man who raised me had become a debt collector. I picked up night shifts at the coffee shop. Steam burned my wrists. The tips barely covered bus fare. At home, I tried one more time with my mother. "Mom, you know I'm his child. Why won't you say it?" She kept stirring soup like I wasn't there. "Sometimes silence keeps a family together," she said, eyes lowered. Together meant everyone except me. I was the cost of their fake peace. Later, my father brushed past me in the hallway. "Don't start drama," he said. "You should be grateful we help." Help looked like a locked door and a lumpy couch. Help looked like my name erased from every bill he paid. I learned to breathe between insults and invoices. I learned to count hours, not love. I knew if I waited for them, I would disappear. I stopped begging and started counting hours. 2 night shifts, 1 morning class, and a bus that always broke. My manager at the coffee shop noticed the bruised wrists. "You need gloves," she said, tossing me a spare pair. Tips went into a plain envelope under my mattress. Rent, books, transit, food. Every dollar had a job. I opened a cheap P.O. box downtown. No more surprises in the family mailbox, I told myself. At the campus aid office, I asked for hardship forms. "I can't pay now," I said, "but I won't quit." The counselor slid a packet across the desk. "Keep records. Anything financial. Everything written," she advised. So I kept screenshots, emails, tuition notices, bank alerts. I saved receipts in a plastic folder with a broken clasp. At night, I walked home with coworkers for safety. Mara pressed a granola bar into my hand. "Eat first." I rented a small room above a nail salon. The window rattled, but the lock belonged only to me. I learned the neighborhood by its sounds at dawn. Garbage trucks, buses, and my breath on the cold air. On weekends, I cleaned out the garage to earn cash. My father liked the free labor. I liked the access. A metal cabinet kept catching my eye. Dented door, fresh scratches around the lock. "Don't snoop," my mother murmured when she passed. "I'm cleaning," I answered, palms dusty, eyes on the floor. At the library, I asked about public records. The clerk smiled kindly. "Birth records are tricky. Start here." I read until my eyes stung and the pages blurred. Fraud, notary stamps, chain of custody. New words became tools. Work taught me to hold my tongue. The mirror taught me to lift my chin anyway. I bought a thrift store blazer that actually fit. "Not yet," I whispered, hanging it on the door. At dinner drop-ins, I kept my voice even and cool. My brother tried to bait me, I wouldn't bite. My father called me dramatic and ungrateful in passing. I wrote the dates down, not the insults. Silence became my shelter, not my sentence. I wasn't hiding, I was hardening. I stopped waiting for permission to exist. I started preparing to prove I was never a mistake. I wasn't planning revenge. I was building proof. A storm rolled in on Saturday, shaking the garage doors. My father shouted for help moving boxes before the roof leaked. I kept my head down and stacked bins against the wall. The dented metal cabinet sat there, glinting under a bare bulb. A coffee can labeled "screws" rattled with more than screws. Inside was a small ring of keys, cold and oily in my palm. "Don't snoop," I told myself, but my hands didn't listen. One key slipped in, turned once, and the cabinet clicked open. Folders were lined like soldiers, names written in my father's hand. Near the back, a red tab stamped private, my name underneath. I slid it free and found a birth certificate on top. Father, Daniel Hart. Mother, Evelyn Hart. No blanks, no doubts. Beneath it, an affidavit of paternity with his bold signature, a notary stamp, a raised seal, and 2 witness lines filled. There was also a lab report I will never forget reading. Date, June 14, 2010. Probability of paternity 99.99%. He knew. He knew when I was 13 and learning fractions. He knew while calling me dramatic, ungrateful, and not his. The next folder hit even harder than the lab report. Hart Family Trust, Schedule B, Beneficiary, Claire Hart, vesting at 21. Common shares listed line by line, with dividend rights attached. A letter from company counsel advised quiet internal transfer options. A handwritten note was paper-clipped to the counsel letter. Move shares to M if C becomes disruptive. Destroy duplicates. At the bottom was an agreement I had never seen. A non-disclosure between my parents tied to marital reconciliation payments. Silence had been purchased, filed, and renewed like an insurance policy. And I was the premium they paid to keep the facade. Footsteps tapped above the storm, then down the garage steps. My mother appeared in the doorway, face drained, hands trembling. "Put it back," she whispered, eyes fixed on the red tab. "Please, Claire, you don't understand what this could do." "I understand perfectly," I said, holding up the DNA report. "You both knew. You let him say I wasn't his." Tears filled her eyes, but her voice stayed small and practiced. "If this comes out, we lose everything. The house, the company." "I already lost a father," I answered, sliding papers into my bag. "What else is there to lose that I haven't lost?" I photographed every page, front and back, date stamped and clear. I copied the files to a thumb drive and sealed the envelope. The P.O. box key pressed a circle into my palm. Evidence needed distance, not a dresser drawer in their house. I locked the cabinet, wiped the handle, and moved another box. Upstairs, the power flickered while the storm pounded the vents. Proof didn't heal me, but it straightened my spine. Proof turned humiliation into leverage, and silence into strategy. Paper can't speak for you until you read it out loud. I asked them to meet on Sunday at 6. Relatives arrived early, sensing smoke waiting for fire. My father took the head of the table. I set a thin folder down and didn't sit. "Before anyone eats," I said, "we're going to read." He snorted like this was theater. "You think a garage makes you a lawyer?" "Affidavit of paternity, your signature, notary seal, 2 witnesses." I slid the lab report across the wood. June 14, 2010. Probability of paternity, 99.99. A fork clinked against a plate and stayed. Chairs shifted. Nobody smiled. "You're here for money," my brother said. I lifted the trust schedule with both hands. Hart Family Trust. Beneficiary, me. Vesting at 21. Dividends listed line by line beside my name. Then a note in my father's handwriting. Move shares to M if C gets disruptive. Destroy duplicates. My mother whispered, "Please put it away. If this gets out, we lose everything." "You already traded me for silence," I answered. "You can't bargain with documents that are time-stamped and scanned." My father finally stood, voice dropping to threat. "Family matters stay in this room. Don't take them outside." "They're already outside," I said, calm and clear. "Copies are off-site, time-stamped, safe." "You don't understand how business works, Claire." "I understand the math," I said. "Shares listed, dividends attached, signatures authenticated." An aunt cleared her throat, fragile but brave. "Daniel, did you sign that affidavit or not?" He looked at her, then at the papers. His jaw moved. No words arrived. I laid out what would happen in plain terms. 1. You correct the lie you told publicly. 2. You restore my shares and unpaid dividends. 3. You stop locking doors that belong to me. "If you refuse, I file in the morning," I said. "Probate court and corporate counsel will read every page." My mother reached for my sleeve like I was 12. I stepped back because I was not 12. Quiet is how we got here. Quiet almost erased me. My father tried one last angle. "You should be grateful we kept you." I met his eyes and let the sentence land. "You didn't keep me, you hid me." Silence spread, different than before. I closed the folder and slid it into my bag. "Decide now or later," I said at the door. "Either way, the truth has my name on it." When the last denial died, I chose my next move out loud. I filed on Monday at 9 a.m. sharp. The clerk stamped my forms, the sound steadied my hands. A legal aid attorney read my copies twice. "You did the hard part," she said. You documented everything. By Wednesday, their council called to discuss resolution. Truth gets urgent the moment a stamp appears. I wanted everything in writing, no hallway deals. My attorney nodded. Paper first, people later. They offered a family apology if I stayed quiet. I declined. Corrections, transfers, and back dividends. In writing. We secured a temporary order protecting my trust shares. Company counsel stopped pretending not to know my name. My father texted, "This could ruin us." I answered, "Lies already did. I'm turning on the lights." My mother called with her soft, practiced voice. "Meet me alone, no lawyers, just us." "Peace without truth is more silence," I said. The settlement arrived because court was next. No speeches. Just signatures that finally meant something. At 4:12 p.m., the transfer notice hit my inbox. Shares restored. Accrued dividends due within 30 days. I changed the lock on my apartment after work. The new key turned like a promise I made myself. Mara brought pizza and 2 paper plates. "Proud of you," she said, bumping my shoulder. I sat on my own couch and breathed on purpose. This wasn't victory over them. It was victory for me. I bought a secondhand desk and a filing cabinet. Proof stays proof when it's safe and organized. Therapy started Fridays at 8 in the morning. We said the heavy words out loud and didn't flinch. On a holiday, my father tried a warm message. I replied once, "Boundaries keep me here, respect them." Some relatives stayed distant. Some apologized in careful sentences. I stopped auditioning for approval and accepted change. I wore the thrift store blazer to my first board meeting. I spoke, voted, and signed my name without shaking. I didn't win a family back. I won myself back. That was the inheritance worth guarding. I left the meeting and stepped into ordinary sunlight. For the first time, it felt like it belonged to me. He hadn't erased me. He had underlined me by accident. If you've ever been in this position, you are not alone.
The rain hadn't let up since dawn, and by the time we stepped out of St. Matthew's Church, the gray Charleston sky felt like it had settled into my bones. Arthur Rowan had been more than my grandfather. He'd been the steady voice in a life that had too often been ruled by sharp words and colder silences. The service was quiet, dignified, filled with faces from the community he'd built so much for. My father, Malcolm, stood front and center, accepting condolences like a politician on election night. His handshakes were firm, his smile measured. I thought maybe, for once, grief had softened him. That hope didn't last long. Hours later, the mourners gone, the scent of damp flowers still heavy in the air, I found myself in the estate's drawing room. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the old oak mantel where Arthur used to rest his arm when telling me one of his stories. Malcolm walked in, his expression stripped of the polite mask he'd worn all day. "It's done," he said flatly. "The estate transfer is official. 400 million. Locked in my name." He said it like a man announcing the weather, then let a small smirk curl his mouth. I nodded slowly, unsure what he expected me to say. He didn't give me the chance. "You're useless now." The words hung there, too absurd to register at first. "Excuse me." "You've coasted long enough," he said, his tone cutting clean through the air. "Pack your things. I want you out of the house by morning. For a moment." I couldn't feel my hands. This was my father, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd lectured me about ambition, now looking at me like I was a piece of unwanted furniture. I stood, forcing my spine straight even as my chest tightened. Fine. My voice didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that. I walked out of the room, the echo of my footsteps following me down the long hall toward the bedroom that had never really felt like mine. I grew up in a house where silence was a form of control. Malcolm's rules were precise and absolute: no slammed doors, no talking back, and never, under any circumstance, challenge his decisions. My earliest memories of him are measured in corrections, posture too slouched, tone too sharp, ambitions too unrealistic. By the time I was 10, I'd learned to keep my victories to myself. If I brought home an A, he'd ask why it wasn't an A+. If I won an award, he'd wonder aloud how many other kids hadn't bothered to compete. Praise was rare, and when it came, it felt more like a footnote than a celebration. Arthur was different. My grandfather's presence was like stepping into a warm patch of sunlight after being indoors too long. He didn't push me to be perfect. He asked me what I wanted and then listened, really listened to the answer. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to work in finance, to understand the currents that moved money and power. Malcolm scoffed, called it a man's world. Arthur just smiled and told me to learn everything I could. Years later, when I was accepted into a competitive graduate program, Malcolm dismissed it as a waste of time and money. I remember sitting on the porch with Arthur that night, my acceptance letter in my lap, wondering if I should turn it down. He sipped his sweet tea, then quietly slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a cashier's check large enough to cover my tuition for the first year. "Don't tell him," Arthur said. "This is between us. Consider it an investment in someone worth investing in." That was Arthur believing in me when it cost him something. Now, standing in my childhood bedroom with a half-packed suitcase, I thought of that night and the quiet pride in his eyes. Malcolm could strip me of this house, but he couldn't erase the foundation Arthur had given me. As I reached for another hanger, something hard shifted inside the lining of my old bookshelf. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Within days of the funeral, the warmth Arthur had brought to the estate seemed to evaporate, replaced by something sharper, colder. Doors that had always been left open were now locked. The library, the sunroom, even the small study where Arthur kept his records, each handle rattled uselessly when I tried it. The staff, people I'd known for years, avoided my eyes. Margaret, the housekeeper who used to sneak me scones from the kitchen, gave only curt nods now, her hands busy with tasks that didn't need doing. When I asked if something was wrong, she murmured, "Mr. Rowan's instructions," before hurrying away. At dinner, Malcolm spoke as if I weren't there. He discussed moving forward with an air of finality, talking about renovations, new investments, and streamlining the household in ways that made it clear I wasn't part of his plans. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone cutting away what he considered dead weight. Back in my room, I tried to focus on packing. My fingers skimmed along the spines of books I'd kept since high school, comfort in a time when I'd needed safe places to hide my thoughts. One, a thick biography Arthur had given me on my 18th birthday, slid forward more easily than the others. When I pulled it free, something small and firm shifted inside. I flipped it open and found a sealed envelope tucked deep between the last few pages. My name, in Arthur's steady hand, stood out against the cream paper. I sat on the edge of the bed, tearing the seal with careful fingers. Inside was a single piece of stationery, the ink faint but deliberate. The will protects those who protect others. No explanation, no context, just that one line, weighty enough to stop me cold. I read it again, tracing the words as if more meaning might appear. Arthur had hidden it for me to find not Malcolm, not anyone else. I folded the note back into the envelope and slid it into my bag, my mind already turning over what it could mean. Malcolm's study smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished leather, the same as it had when Arthur used it, only now the warmth was gone. Malcolm sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, leaning back in Arthur's old chair as though it had always belonged to him. A crystal tumbler of bourbon rested at his elbow, half full, catching the light from the desk lamp. "Sit," he said, not looking up from the papers in front of him. I didn't move until he finally raised his eyes, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I suppose you've heard," he began, as though the whole city wasn't already buzzing. 400 million. All mine. Arthur was generous. His voice carried no trace of grief, only the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game they'd stacked in their favor. I stayed quiet, letting him fill the air. "You've had a long, comfortable stay here. Callista," he continued, his tone shifting to something colder. "But you're not a child anymore. You're a financial burden. And frankly, you've been coasting, He said it like a verdict, not an opinion. I almost laughed. I'd been working since I was 16, paying my own way through most of grad school thanks to Arthur. Not him, but arguing now would be like shouting into the wind. "I want you out by morning," he said, leaning forward. Elbows on the desk. No drama, no drawn-out goodbyes. This is my house now, and I decide who belongs here. His gaze lingered on me, waiting for the crack, the flinch, the desperate protest. I felt the weight of Arthur's note in my pocket, the words burning against my leg. The will protects those who protect others. I straightened my shoulders. Fine. No tremor in my voice. No hesitation. I rose, turned, and walked out without another word. Upstairs. I finished packing the last of my clothes into the worn leather suitcase Arthur had given me years ago. The envelope stayed in my coat pocket, as if moving it might weaken whatever strength it had given me in that room. By the time the grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9, my bags were by the door. I didn't look back when I stepped outside into the cool Charleston night. By the next afternoon, I was hauling my suitcase up the narrow staircase of a brick walk-up in downtown Charleston. The apartment was barely big enough for me to stretch my arms without touching both walls, but it was mine, no locked doors. No eyes watching to see if I measured up. I'd sold a few pieces of jewelry Malcolm had given me over the years, gifts more for show than sentiment. The cash wasn't much, but it was enough to cover the deposit and my first month's rent. My job as a financial analyst let me work remotely, so I set up my laptop on the little kitchen table and kept my hours steady, forcing normalcy into the chaos. Still. At night, I'd catch myself pulling the envelope from my coat pocket, rereading Arthur's words. The will protects those who protect others. It didn't sound like something he'd say casually, and it certainly didn't sound like a message meant for Malcolm. I started digging quietly public records, probate filings, even old news articles about estates with unusual clauses. Most of it was noise, but every so often, I'd find something that made my pulse jump. Trusts that released funds only under specific conditions. Wills tied to joint ventures or community projects. Arthur had been meticulous in everything he did. It was possible, maybe even likely, that his will carried the same precision. 3 days after I moved in, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me swipe to answer. Callista Rowan. The voice was crisp, professional, with an undercurrent of dry amusement. "Yes, this is Evelyn Cole. I was your grandfather's attorney." A pause. Deliberate. "We should talk about his will. It's unusual." There was a flicker of satisfaction in her tone, like she was holding back from saying more until we were face to face. I sat up straighter. "How unusual," she gave a short, knowing laugh. "Let's just say your father's week is about to get a lot more complicated. Can you come to my office tomorrow?" I glanced at the envelope on the table, my mind already racing ahead. Evelyn Cole's office was nothing like I expected. No polished mahogany or antique rugs, just clean lines, muted colors, and a wall of neatly labeled files. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, then folded her hands, studying me with the kind of look that says she already knows more than she's letting on. "I've been waiting for you to call," she began. "Your grandfather anticipated certain dynamics in this family." I arched a brow, meaning my father. "Meaning exactly your father," she said, pulling a thick binder toward her. "Arthur placed his estate everything in a trust. Malcolm cannot access a cent of the $400 million unless specific conditions are met." I leaned forward, pulse quickening. What conditions? Her lips curved slightly, like she'd been waiting for that question. "He must complete a community redevelopment project that meets city approval and Arthur's philanthropic standards, and he must do it with you as co-executor. Equal authority. Equal signature rights." I sat back, trying to process. "You're saying he can't do it without me?" "Correct. There's more. She continued, "During the 12 months it takes to complete the project, there can be no lawsuits between you and Malcolm, no public estrangement, and no formal withdrawal from the arrangement by either party. Any violation, and the trust dissolves, and the money Evelyn flipped to the final page of the clause. Half would go to the charities Arthur named, the other half directly to you." For a moment, all I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioner. I thought about Malcolm in his study, smug and certain he'd already won. I thought about him telling me I was useless. Arthur really planned this, I murmured. He wanted to ensure the person he trusted most was in a position to protect his legacy. Evelyn said, "And that person wasn't your father." I traced my fingers along the edge of the desk. A slow, deliberate motion. When does Malcolm find out Evelyn's smile widened? Just slightly. He already has. I felt the shift in my chest anticipation, steady and cold. Then I suppose I should be expecting a knock at my door. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after leaving Evelyn's office, there was a sharp knock on my apartment door when I opened it. Malcolm stood there expensively dressed, but the edges frayed. His face was pale, a faint sheen of sweat along his hairline. "Callista," he said, forcing a smile. "Thought we should talk? Family to family?" I stepped aside without a word, letting him into the cramped living room. He glanced around, eyes lingering on the second-hand furniture like it was a personal insult. "The bank tells me there's been a misunderstanding," he began, settling onto the sofa. "Funds are tied up in some sort of trust. Ridiculous red tape." His tone was light, but I could hear the strain under it. "It's not a misunderstanding," I said. "It's the will." He waved a dismissive hand. "Your grandfather was sentimental. I'm sure we can work around it." He leaned forward, softening his voice. "You and I, blood is blood. We've had our differences, but we can come together now. Make this work for both of us." Arthur's words flickered in my mind. "Don't react. Negotiate." "What exactly are you proposing?" I asked evenly. "That you sign whatever's needed so I can move forward." "You'll get something." "Of course." I held his gaze. "That's not how it's written." His smile thinned. "Callista, I'm offering you a way to make this painless. You think you can run a multi-million-dollar project without me? You'll sink us both." The threat was there, coiled under the words. But I didn't flinch. "If you want the money," I said, "you'll follow the terms. All of them." A muscle in his jaw twitched. For a moment, I thought he might explode, but instead he stood, straightening his jacket. "Think about it," he said, and walked out without another glance. I closed the door behind him, already knowing I wouldn't need to. He'd be back. 2 days after our first meeting, I had the agreement ready. Evelyn had helped me refine it, each clause crafted with the same precision Arthur had used in his will. Malcolm would publicly acknowledge me as co-executor, cover my living costs for the duration of the project, and transfer 3 specific estate properties into my name, outright no conditions, no reversals. When I slid the document across Evelyn's conference table, Malcolm's eyes skimmed it, then flicked up to me. "You can't be serious." "Every word," I said. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "I'm not signing this." "You're extorting me." I didn't blink. "The will is extorting you." "I'm just giving you a way forward. For the next week." He stalled, claimed he was busy with other matters, sent back pages with red ink scrawled across the margins, even consulted another lawyer, a sharp-suited man who lasted 1 meeting before quietly confirming the truth Arthur's language was airtight. Without my cooperation, Malcolm's $400 million might as well have been buried in the ground. When he finally returned to Evelyn's office, he was quieter. Not defeated. Exactly, but there was a weight in his posture, a tightness around his mouth. He picked up the pen, rolled it between his fingers, and signed each page with quick, sharp strokes. Evelyn notarized it, her expression neutral. though I caught the faintest glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. Malcolm pushed the signed packet toward me, his knuckles white. "I hope you know what you're doing." "Callista." "I do," I said, tucking the agreement into my folder. We stood, the air between us heavy with everything unspoken. He left without shaking my hand, the door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in years, I felt the balance shift not just in paperwork, but in power, and it was only the beginning. The waterfront lot had been little more than a patch of cracked asphalt and weeds when we began. Arthur's plans called for something alive, glass walls opening to the harbor, classrooms for job training, and space for local markets on weekends. From the first week, I made it my business to know every detail. I walked the site with the contractors each morning, reviewed invoices at night, and built relationships with the city officials whose signatures we needed. The more I showed up, the more the crews looked to me for decisions. Malcolm hated it. He showed up late to meetings, floated ideas to trim the budget that ignored both code and Arthur's vision. Whenever I refused, he muttered about me being impossible to work with. But he never tried to shut me out. He couldn't. The will made sure of that. The press loved the story Rowan Family Unites to honor Patriarch's dream. They photographed us side by side, smiling for the cameras. In the glossy spreads, we looked like a team. Behind those smiles, every conversation was a negotiation. By month 11, the center's steel frame was complete, glass panels catching the morning sun. Malcolm stood with me on the balcony overlooking the water, watching crews set the final supports. "You've handled yourself better than I expected," he said, the words clipped but genuine. "Better than you wanted." "Maybe," I replied. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Maybe. It wasn't trust, it wasn't forgiveness, but it was an acknowledgement, however grudging, that I wasn't the liability he'd painted me to be. And in a few weeks, the project would be finished, and the will's conditions met. The ribbon cutting drew a crowd large enough to spill onto the sidewalks. City leaders, reporters, and families from the neighborhood gathered under a bright spring sun, the new community center gleaming behind us. Malcolm stood to my left, hands clasped, smile practiced. The cameras loved him, but the speeches weren't his to give. That was Arthur's stipulation and mine. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the podium. I spoke about Arthur's belief that wealth meant little if it didn't lift others. I thanked the contractors, volunteers, and the community who'd worked alongside us. I didn't mention Malcolm. The applause started slow, then built into something steady and warm, rolling over the courtyard. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Malcolm's expression tighten, his jaw set as the focus stayed on me. By the end of the day, the trust's conditions were fulfilled. Malcolm would have his fortune. I had something different, 3 prime estate properties in my name, and the public credit for bringing Arthur's vision to life. As the crowd dispersed, I slipped away down the side path, my heels clicking against the new brickwork. The center stood behind me, alive with voices, exactly as Arthur had imagined. I didn't look back at Malcolm. I didn't need to. I'd taken the part of my family's legacy worth keeping and left the rest in the past. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly above me as I sat hunched over in a hard plastic chair. My palms were clammy, my knees bouncing against the floor in a rhythm I couldn't control. On the desk in front of me, Detective Ruiz leaned toward the computer screen, rewinding the grainy footage frame by frame. There he was, Nathan, my brother, his familiar gait, his baseball cap tugged low, his jacket zipped all the way to his chin. The timestamp blinked Friday morning, 9 o'clock. I felt my breath catch when I saw him appear on the screen, walking directly toward my apartment door. He didn't hesitate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a key, and slipped it into the lock. The door swung open without resistance. My chest tightened. That key was never meant for him. I'd given a spare set to my parents years ago, trusting they'd only use them for emergencies. Somehow, they'd found their way into Nathan's hands. The footage rolled on. He disappeared into my apartment for less than a minute. When he stepped back out, his hand clutched something small but unmistakable, my brand new iPhone 16 Pro Max. He glanced around casually, as if he were carrying groceries, then walked straight off camera. My throat felt dry. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to swallow the disbelief. I'd wanted to be wrong. I'd hoped I'd find my phone misplaced, or maybe sold by mistake to some stranger online. But there was no mistake here. My brother had stolen it. Detective Ruiz let the footage play out in silence before pausing it on Nathan's face. "That him?" he asked. I nodded, though my neck felt stiff. "Yes, that's Nathan Hensley, my brother." The words tasted bitter, like admitting to something shameful. Ruiz scribbled notes in his pad. "We'll need you to file a full report." "Do you have proof of purchase and registration for the device I reached into my purse?" Pulling out the receipt I'd carefully folded the day I brought the phone home. I'd been so proud, saving for months to buy something that finally felt like mine. Now it was evidence. Ruiz looked at me with steady eyes. "All right, we'll take it from here." I stared at the frozen image of Nathan on the screen, my chest heavy, and realized this wasn't just about a phone. This was about trust, about years of sacrifice, about a family line I hadn't thought could be crossed until now. And yet, I knew I had to start from the beginning, long before the footage at the station. I had been cast in a role I never auditioned for. Somewhere along the way, I became the one who always had to pick up the pieces. When Nathan and Lydia fell short on rent, it was me they called. When the boys needed uniforms for soccer or money for a field trip, the requests came directly to my phone. Groceries, utility bills, even unexpected car repairs, it all seemed to circle back to me. At first, I told myself it was what any good sister would do. I had a steady job, no children, and the means to help. It felt like a way of proving my worth, of showing I was dependable. And whenever I wrote the checks or slipped cash into Lydia's hand, the relief on their faces gave me a fleeting sense of purpose. My parents encouraged it without ever saying the words outright. They praised me as the responsible one, the steady one, the daughter who could always be counted on. But behind that praise was an expectation so ingrained it became invisible. If Nathan struggled, I was supposed to step in. If Lydia asked, I was supposed to say yes. Over the years, I began to notice how invisible my own needs had become. Holidays meant me buying extra gifts so the children wouldn't feel deprived. Family dinners meant I quietly covered the bill without acknowledgement. And when I hinted at taking a vacation or saving for something of my own, the conversation always turned back to what Nathan's family needed. It was subtle at first, but the truth had been there all along. I wasn't seen as Clara, the sister, the daughter, the aunt. I was Clara, the wallet, the one who never complained, the one who always made sacrifices. That pattern held for years until the night at dinner when I finally broke it. The shift began with something as ordinary as my phone finally giving out. The screen had been cracked for months, the battery barely holding a charge. And yet, I kept using it because it still worked. When it finally shut down one morning and refused to turn back on, I almost felt relieved. Of course, my family turned it into a punchline. At the next dinner, Nathan laughed and said I was the only person he knew still walking around with a fossil. Lydia smirked and asked if I was trying to set a record for how long someone could cling to a broken device. Even my parents chimed in, suggesting I was just being cheap. I smiled and let them think what they wanted, the same way I always had. What none of them knew was that I had been planning for this moment. Every month, I had tucked away a little money, slowly building a fund for something that was entirely mine. No guilt, no obligations, no one else's needs attached, just a reward for my own discipline. When I walked into the store and asked for the iPhone 16 Pro Max, I felt a surge of pride I hadn't expected. The salesman read the total, and instead of reaching for financing or a credit card, I pulled out my checkbook. Signing my name across that slip of paper felt like claiming ownership not just of a phone, but of my effort, my patience, my independence. The moment I held it in my hand, sleek and flawless, a quiet thrill rushed through me. It wasn't about the technology. It was about proof that I could work toward something and keep it for myself. For once, I wasn't sacrificing or settling. Driving home that evening, I couldn't stop glancing at the box in the passenger seat. It was more than a device. It was a promise I had made to myself and finally kept. I had no idea how quickly that promise would be tested. By the time Saturday rolled around, I was almost giddy. Family dinners at my parents' house were a long-standing tradition, and for once, I had something I wanted to share. I tucked my new phone into my bag, not planning to brag, but hoping maybe just this once they might be happy for me. The kitchen was warm with the smell of pot roast when I arrived. My nephews were racing toy cars across the floor. While Mom fussed over side dishes, I slipped into my usual seat. And before long, conversation turned to the week. So, Clara, Dad said between bites, "Did you ever replace that old phone? Your mother said it finally died." I reached into my bag and set the iPhone on the table. The polished surface caught the light, and for a moment, there was silence. My nephew's eyes widened. "Whoa, Aunt Clara," Lucas said, leaning closer. "Does it do slow motion? Can you show me?" I laughed and unlocked the screen, showing them the camera features. Caleb giggled as I filmed a quick clip of him making faces, then replayed it in slow motion. Their laughter filled the room, and for the first time in a long time, I felt proud instead of defensive. Mom picked it up carefully, turning it over in her hands. "This is beautiful. Clara, you always make practical choices, but this, it's lovely." Dad nodded. Smart investment. These things last. Their approval felt rare, almost fragile, and I held on to it for a moment. But then I noticed Nathan and Lydia. They weren't smiling. Nathan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the phone. Lydia tilted her head, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A phone like this," she said, her voice syrupy, "really belongs with someone who can use it all day like a mom. There are so many things I could do with it." The warmth drained from my chest. I slid the phone back toward me, suddenly aware of the sharp shift in the room. What had started as pride now felt like a warning. The conversation that had drifted easily around the table snapped into silence when Nathan cleared his throat. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes still fixed on the phone sitting by my plate. "You know," he said, almost casually, "it makes more sense if Lydia has that phone." I blinked at him. Sure, I'd misheard. "Excuse me." He gestured toward his wife, who was dabbing her lips with a napkin, looking far too pleased. "You don't need it the way she does. Lydia's with the kids all day. She manages schedules, school apps, doctor's appointments. A phone like that would make her life easier. You, on the other hand, you just go to work and come home. You could manage with something simpler." Lydia's smile tightened, but she didn't protest. She let him speak for her, nodding slightly as if this was all perfectly reasonable. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I was stunned. Nathan, I just bought this phone. With my money. For myself. That's exactly the point. He pressed on. "You can afford another one. Lydia can't. You've always helped us out before. Why should this be any different?" I turned to my parents, expecting them to step in, to tell him how ridiculous he sounded. Instead, Mom sighed and said softly, "Clara, you know she does have a lot on her plate. Maybe sharing would be the generous thing." Dad's voice followed, calm and reasonable, the way he'd always tried to settle disputes. "Your brother isn't wrong. You're single. You have more flexibility. Lydia's raising a family. Doesn't it make sense for the resources to go where they're most needed? My face grew hot. It's not a resource. It's mine. I'm not giving it away just because you've decided she deserves it more. Lydia finally spoke, her tone sharp. You're being selfish. You've always had more than us. And now you're hoarding something you don't even need as much. I could use it for the kids' schooling, for doctor updates, for whatever you want. I cut in, but not with my phone. Buy your own. The room bristled with tension. Nathan's eyes narrowed. My parents looked wounded, and Lydia's mouth twisted into a pout that had always worked in her favor. But this time, I didn't bend. I slipped the phone back into my bag, gathered my plate, and stood up from the table, leaving their stunned silence behind me as I walked out. The morning after that dinner, my phone lit up before I'd even poured my coffee. First it was Mom, her voice unusually clipped. Clara, you need to think about what's best for everyone. Lydia is pregnant. Stress isn't good for her. Just let her have the phone. I ended the call without answering. Minutes later, Dad called, his tone almost scolding. You've always been the practical one. Don't make this into something ugly. She needs it more than you do. By noon, Lydia had started texting me directly, long paragraphs, full of dramatic pauses, about how much she juggled and how this one gesture could ease her burden. She sent ultrasound pictures, little captions about doing it for the baby. Nathan followed with shorter, sharper messages. You're tearing this family apart. Stop being selfish. It's just a phone. The words piled up, day after day. I silenced notifications. But even then, the vibration of the phone felt like a pulse of accusation in my pocket. It didn't stop with them. Aunt Caroline called from across the state, saying she'd heard about the situation and couldn't believe I'd deny Lydia something so helpful. My cousin left a voicemail suggesting I be the bigger person. It was as though the entire family tree had been recruited to shame me into compliance. I kept replaying the dinner in my head, wondering if I'd been too sharp, too defensive. For a moment, doubt wormed its way in. Maybe I should just let it go, replace the phone, keep the peace. But then I'd remember the hours of overtime, the years of restraint, the quiet pride I'd felt when I finally bought something for myself. That pride had been real, and it wasn't something I was willing to surrender. So I refused to answer their calls. I deleted their texts. When Mom showed up outside my apartment one evening, I didn't open the door. For once, I chose silence over surrender. The pressure didn't let up, but I held firm, even as the weight of their disappointment pressed harder each day. Then, one weekend, silence arrived, but not in the way I expected. I came back from a quick weekend trip feeling lighter than I had in weeks. A college friend had invited me to spend a couple of days in the city, and for once, I'd allowed myself the indulgence of laughter, good food, and hours spent without the constant vibration of family demands. Dragging my small suitcase into my apartment, I set it by the door and reached instinctively for my phone. The spot on the counter where I'd left it was empty. I checked my bag again, then the side table, then the bedroom, each search more frantic than the last. My pulse quickened as I tore through drawers, under cushions, even inside the fridge as if I might have placed it there absent-mindedly. But it was nowhere. A cold wave of realization hit me. Someone had taken it. I marched downstairs and knocked on Mr. Peterson's door. He was the building manager and had always been kind to me. One look at my face and he opened his office. "Check the cameras," I said, my voice barely steady. We scrolled through the weekend footage until Friday morning came into view. My breath caught in my throat as the image sharpened Nathan, walking straight to my apartment door. He pulled a key from his pocket, unlocked the door, and slipped inside like he belonged there. Less than a minute later, he emerged, my phone in his hand. I gripped the edge of the desk, my nails digging into the wood. The violation sank deeper than the theft itself. He hadn't just taken my phone, he'd used the spare keys I'd trusted my parents with years ago. Keys meant for emergencies, now twisted into a weapon against me. I pressed my hand to my chest, struggling to breathe. I wasn't just angry. I felt exposed, unsafe in my own home. I asked Mr. Peterson to save a copy of the footage. Then I stood there in the dim light of his office. Knowing I couldn't ignore it this time, I had to confront them. I barely remembered the drive over, my hands clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles burned. When I pulled up to Nathan's house, there it was my phone, glowing through the living room window as if mocking me. I marched up the steps and pounded on the door. Nathan opened it, looking almost amused. Behind him, Lydia sat on the couch, my iPhone in her hand. She tilted it toward me, the case I had picked out gleaming under the lamp. "It's ours now," she said smoothly, sliding her finger across the screen. "You wouldn't share. So we had to make the choice for you." My chest tightened. "You stole it. You broke into my home." Nathan stepped forward, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "No. Clara, we took what should have been given. You don't need something like this. Lydia does. She's raising kids, keeping this family together, while you live alone with nothing to worry about. Family deserves it more than you do." Lydia smirked. "Besides, everyone agrees with us. Even Mom and Dad said you should help." I stared at them both, rage coursing through me. They weren't ashamed. They weren't even trying to deny it. They believed they were entitled. "Give me back my phone," I said, my voice low. Nathan chuckled, shaking his head. "You won't do anything. You won't risk dragging family through the mud over a piece of technology. You've always been too scared of conflict." Lydia leaned back, laughing softly as if I'd just told a joke. "Go ahead, Clara. Try us." Their confidence was suffocating. But as I turned to leave, gripping the footage on the USB in my pocket, I knew exactly what I had to do next. The next morning, I walked into the police station with the footage in hand and a knot in my stomach. Detective Ruiz greeted me calmly, ushering me into his office. I slid the USB across the desk, and he plugged it in without a word. Nathan's figure appeared on the screen, unlocking my door, disappearing inside, and emerging with my phone. "That's your brother Ruiz asked." I nodded, my voice steady despite the tremor inside me. "Yes, and that's my phone." He studied the paperwork I'd brought receipt, warranty, registration, and nodded. "This is enough. We'll move forward with theft charges." Hearing those words brought a mix of relief and sorrow. It felt necessary, but it also felt like drawing a line I could never erase. Later that afternoon, Ruiz called me back to the station. My parents were there, pacing in the lobby, their faces red with fury. Mom rushed at me, gripping my arm. "Clara, you can't do this! He's your brother! You're tearing this family apart!" Dad's voice thundered behind her. "Drop the charges now!" How could you drag your own blood into court over a phone? Their pleas didn't sting anymore. They sounded hollow, rehearsed. I met their eyes and spoke clearly. "I'll drop the charges under one condition: you leave me alone. No calls, no visits, no messages, nothing. I want no part in this family anymore." Mom gasped like I'd slapped her. Dad shook his head in disbelief, but I didn't waver. When Ruiz returned with the paperwork, I signed. The charges were dropped, but so was every tie I had left. That night, I drove home in silence, the weight of finality pressing down, knowing the quiet that followed would change everything. Months slipped by in a strange, almost unfamiliar calm. The silence that once felt like punishment now settled around me like a blanket. My phone no longer lit up with guilt-soaked texts or endless missed calls. For the first time in years, my evenings belonged only to me. Work became easier without the constant weight of family emergencies pressing at my back. I went out with friends without worrying if I'd come home to another crisis. Slowly, I began to feel lighter, as though I'd been carrying stones in my pockets and had finally set them down. One afternoon, my Aunt Caroline called from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, her voice was careful, almost coaxing. "Clara, honey, your mother wanted me to tell you Lydia had the baby, a little girl. Don't you want to see pictures? Maybe it's time to move past all this." I closed my eyes, listening to the same refrain I'd heard 100 times before. "No," I said softly but firmly. "I don't want to see them. I don't want to be pulled back into the same cycle. I meant what I said. I'm done." There was a pause, then a sigh. Before she hung up, the quiet that followed didn't feel like loss. It felt like strength. That evening, I sat on my couch, unlocked my iPhone, and scrolled through the photos I'd taken since cutting ties, laughing with friends, sunsets on walks, snapshots of moments that belonged only to me. The phone wasn't just a device anymore. It was a reminder that I could choose myself, even when others tried to strip that choice away, and each time I touched the screen, I knew I'd never go back.